Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to White World's Lost Lands, the mythical history of the West by instructor Ben Woodard. This seminar investigates the historical and ongoing role of myth, pseudo-history, and the imagination of lost lands in constructing and reinforcing right-wing and white supremacist ideologies in the West. In the second half of the 19th century, Western European societies, confronted by new discoveries in archaeology and the deep history of non-Western civilizations, responded to their own anxieties about origins, disintegration, and racial hierarchy by inventing and popularizing narratives about lost civilizations such as Atlantis, Lemuria, Hyperborea, and Thule. These myths were not mere fantasies or harmless stories. Instead, they became powerful tools for rationalizing colonial domination and constructing a narrative of European cultural primacy. The logic of social Darwinism, initially couched as a biological theory, migrated into anthropology and history, serving the needs of empire and white supremacism by presenting Europe as both the pinnacle and the point of origin of civilization. Even when archaeological evidence from Victorian era colonial expeditions revealed the antiquity and sophistication of non Western societies, these findings were quickly assimilated or distorted by myths that posited Europe as the inheritor, if not the source, of all ancient greatness. The seminar takes up Sylvia Wynter's analysis of how the European colonial project universalized its own concept of man and explores how this form of narrative power persists into the present, both in contemporary far right and alt right movements and within pop culture, particularly science fiction and digital conspiracy milieux. Throughout the sessions, we will examine the historical genesis, transformations, and contemporary implications of these myths, aiming to understand why they remain so resilient and what this persistence reveals about the ideological operations of whiteness and tradition in the West. Ben Woodard is currently a fellow at the ICI Berlin. He received his PhD in theory and criticism from Western University in 2016. From 2017 to 2020, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the IPK at Leuphana University, where he completed a habilitation on the analytical continental divide in philosophy through the work of F.H. Bradley. Since 2020, Ben has lectured at the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy, mostly on the history of philosophy and politics of the life sciences. In broad terms, his work focuses on the relationship between naturalism and the uh, naturalism and idealism in the long 19th century. Ben also writes on science fiction and horror film and literature. He is the author of numerous articles and three books: Slime Dynamics, Generation, Mutation, and the Creep Life, on the undergrounded Earth towards new geophilosophy, and Shelling Naturalism, Motion, Space, and the Volition of Thought. He is also the translator of French philosophy, and in particular the work of Gilles Chatelet. Ben is also a founding member of the philosophy collective PS, which is based at the Performing Arts Center PAF in Saint-Erme, France. Ben, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. And so for today, we'll sort of talk about pragmatic things towards the end of the lecture, and then also talk about presentations and that sort of thing. And we'll save the introductions of everyone till next week. And so first off, sort of want to say why this course or how this course came about, because it seems maybe sort of a somewhat eclectic grouping of things on the one hand, but also I think everything is in my head at least, quite conceptually connected and deeply related to one another. So in large part, I mean, as was stated in the description, a lot of the some of the initial ideas of this came out of Sylvia Wynter's work, right? Especially the conceptions of man that she has. And in sort of working with that, especially during the last few years, part of my attempt was to try to use her work to address especially scientific racism, and to really look at how scientific racism and a sort of rejuvenation of eugenics has become particularly strong in the last few years, although it sort of never left, right? It was never dormant, but it sort of gained renewed strength lately. And so part of the plan was to use Wynter's work to sort of try to address this. And it became quite difficult for numerous reasons. One, because of the reception of Wynter's work was kind of one issue. And the other thing was, many people didn't see connections between Wynter and the sciences, and many of the works that addressed scientific racism would either sort of critique the sciences in general, from a sort of continental perspective and in general, or from a sort of analytic perspective, they would sort of critique kind of this very kind of soft epistemological critique of like, well, we just have to do a better job of discerning between, good science and bad science, basically, or, have better understandings of bias. And so it was pretty clear to me in sort of writing a book that is, I think, maybe permanently homeless on Sylvia Wynter and the sciences. One of the things that came clear was this notion that there's a lot of sort of background or kind of very deep running concepts and feelings and aesthetics and things like this that are not really addressed in a lot of the text looking at scientific racism, or the text looking at the sort of possibilities of Sylvia Wynter's work, on the other hand. So the goal with the class is to sort of try and address this, to sort of see what is Wynter's work in relationship to scientific racism, but also more generally, right, in terms of how scientific racism is bound up with the history of colonialism, but that beyond, I mean, not without, of course, but in addition to the sort of historical critiques, I think there persists this kind of very deep mythic element. And I think Wynter's argument that we can't just forget myth, we can't just obliterate myth with better rationality, but rather we have to reformat it. And I think that idea in particular is important for dealing with and battling against other myths, right? And so I think this is why the course is partially a kind of sort of political unconscious, or analysis of the political unconscious of the alt-right and all these, or what we might just call the right nowadays. I mean, that's another question to have, or discussion to have. But also, how historically different is this from the kind of fantastical mythic constructions that really, really took off in the sort of recognizable political vein, I think, really in the 19th century. And of course, borrowing from older traditions, but this kind of industry of these kinds of myths, I think, really is of that time. So, and the other sort of important part of this, before kind of jumping into the slides, is, I think, also this whole question of the left-right distinction when it comes to myths, and it comes to the kind of political or often sort of anti-political thinking that is selectively scientific, selectively rational, partially religious, that has persisted in holding on to these kinds of myths, right? The people who have been enamored by the same myths have often been on very different parts of the political spectrum as traditionally defined. And I think we see that today also in a form that is not so different, but that is something to be discussed and probably argued about a bit. Okay, so with that, I will start with the slides. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see them, the slides. Okay. So in terms of myth, so the decisive absence of faith is resolute faith. The fact that a universe without myth is the ruin of the universe, reduced to the nothingness of things, in the process of depriving us, equates deprivation with the revelation of the universe. If by abolishing the mythic universe we have lost the universe, the action of a revealing loss is itself connected to the death of myth. And today, because a myth is dead or dying, we see through it more easily than if it were alive. It is the need that perfects the transparency, the suffering, which makes the suffering become joyful. Night is also a sun, and the absence of myth is also a myth, the coldest, the purest, the only true myth. So that's Georges Bataille. And we will read that text next week, but just to keep it in the back of your mind, what do we need of myth? Do we really need it? What does it do? So as mentioned, a huge part of sort of colonial expansion, especially that of the sort of second wave of European colonialism, has to do with sort of filling out, right, the map of the world in various ways. And of course, as different empires expanded, different imaginaries about the globe and about geography and about the world changed, right? Seemingly, or some of it seemed to change permanently based on relatively, it would seem, straightforward empirical experience. You know, finding there's a massive land where there was only supposed to be water, for instance. But of course, this whole exploration, this whole set of colonial adventures, or, to put it lightly, obviously did not simply unveil a world, right, to a especially or straightforwardly rational enterprise of European civilization, whatever that meant, right? One of the biggest themes in Sylvia Wynter's work, and Sylvia Wynter, who's been writing and thinking for you know well over 60 years now, sort of has constructed and attempted in various ways to sort of show the real depths or the real effects of this encounter of different peoples, right, in the most extensive sort of mental, geographical, anthropological, artistic, aesthetic, you know, kind of thing. And her sort of great work, which, apparently is still being reworked and hopefully finished someday soon. This great work of hers, which she attempted many decades ago, called Black Metamorphosis, sort of looked at essentially at everything that went into the creation of African American culture in particular, right? How every, colonial expansion, the machinery of slavery, all the cultural appropriation and violence and everything that took place after, to say, what does it mean to say that all these things, most of which look like historical travesties, also created a new culture? How do we sort of come to terms with this? Right. And this is why reading Wynter's work is often very difficult for people, uh, regardless of where they find themselves, because she never lets things fall too easily into set modes of thinking. She was sort of constantly railing against the academy. She was sort of kicked out or kicked herself out of of several prestigious institutions. Did not want to be siloed into an African American studies department, right? She wanted to just to be able to do history, to do philosophy, to do these kinds of things without all the sort of subdivisions. Um, and to also challenge the role of the academy at the same time, for the world outside, right? Some very famous pieces of hers doing this, asking people to respond to, the LA riots in the wake of the Rodney King beating, for instance, right? Trying to get academics to really engage, while at the same time having a hugely broad, massively extensive grasp of postmodern theory, literary theory, you know, global literature, delving into biology, into neuroscience, all these kinds of things in a way that is not what maybe some of us have become accustomed to in this, not in this kind of, throwing all the spices in the pot kind of mode, but really, or cherry picking the things, but really like spending, extensive amounts of time with each of these disciplines as if they're all touching on the same object. And one of those objects is this kind of conception of man, right? And of course, man, in the sense, as she puts it, right, as this overrepresentation of the human, right? So that one culture or one sort of set of cultures, creates a concept man, which they think stands in for and is the same as the human, right? And sort of consequences of that over time, right, over thousands of years, is what she essentially tries to draw out at great length. So it wouldn't be possible to sort of do an overview of her work in general. It's just it's a massive amount. It's a huge project. But the essay that I signed, and there'll be another one I think also I'll add towards the end of the course, is sort of is sort of seen as a kind of necessary background understanding in a way for the whole course. And so I'll try just briefly here to outline some of the general movements in her work, which I think over the decades you sort of see her shifting her focus, and then sort of move on to this conception of the different conceptions of man and what that means. So in her sort of very early work from the sort of 1960s, mid 60s, and sort of early 70s, sort of up until the point where she attempts to write the first draft of Black Metamorphosis, which she sort of abandons and chops up into essays, to go back to much later. One of the things that she discusses, which for people who are familiar with the relationship between African American or more broadly Black studies and Marxist studies, will probably know some version of this, right? She's in many ways a post-Marxist. She's in the mid 70s, I think, especially sympathetic to certain French critiques of Marx, Lyotard's The Mirror of Production, for instance, a few other texts, right? But she, makes this critique, which I think has become a very standard thing of debate nowadays. Was this, critiquing Marxist political economy and its equation of the figure of slave and serf, right? So again, the idea that when Marx talks about, the creation of the creation of property rights, sort of kicking all the landowners off their land towards the end of the first volume of Capital, right? That this idea that this is the kind of mode of the beginning of proper capitalism, right, is very, in Winter's view, not only, of course, very Eurocentric or maybe even Anglo-centric, to be more specific. Like this model is maybe not as universalizable as Marx maybe vaguely claims. Maybe not, he's not making a strict claim. Maybe it's a kind of like a, just a model. But it also forgets, or it doesn't quite understand, the relationship of slavery in the beginnings of capital, right? So the fact that, as she points out, that there's multiple levels of alienation on top of this, right? The dispossession of one's property is piled on that with the figure of the enslaved, right, is of course, alienation of one's own body, right, on top of one's labor being sold, right, one being acquitted with their labor, one's body is also a commodity. And on top of this, as she points out, especially with women who are enslaved, right, even their children, right, even their future children are also um, destined to be property in the system. So this is even like another level of alienation, right? One's own children are not even, don't even belong in the sort of weakest sense to anyone. So this is sort of one, mode that she emphasizes quite extensively. She then sort of delves into some like readings of certain utopian and dystopian literature. She looks at sort of musical practices, especially in the Caribbean. And sort of looks at sort of centers the Caribbean in various ways as a sort of center of culture. What does it mean to see culture coming from, coming from a place that is not, that doesn't treat Europe as the center? And one of the things that she tries to push and emphasize is, this idea of, the whole mode of doing cultural analysis or the whole mode of doing aesthetics. In this sense, she's really kind of going against some comfort zones of some of the bigger deconstructionists or some of the more literary postmodernists, sort of right critiquing, the sort of bourgeois individuality, right, which again is, you know, maybe more familiar from certain Marxist critiques of literature, but she's kind of doing that from within deconstruction, right? So kind of pushing just deconstruction further against itself in this regard, right? So that there's also a model, just as there's a certain understanding of capital from this kind of white landowner, working class or underclass, there's also sort of an aspirational model towards individuality in this kind of in sort of the unwritten assumptions of aesthetic critique or art critique, right? So there's another kind of erasure going on there. And it's also about, doing things that can read Derridian in a certain sense, right? Like pushing against the written word, or emphasizing the spoken word over the written word in certain ways, but also doing that within, the sort of musical practices of the Caribbean, for instance, right? Talking about sort of pushing certain anthropological analyses into a sort of what would otherwise be a textual analysis to kind of break it in a certain way, right? So again, she's trying to sort of see the like most deepest assumptions of these discourses, which claim to be going against all the assumptions of the discourse, right? She's trying to push it uh, a bit more. And then, so those first two aspects are a little bit less maybe relevant to the course than these last two. And they're also relevant, but these ones I think even more so. So I think especially when she starts writing in the 1980s and the early 90s, she really emphasizes, she starts talking about Darwin and especially talking about doing various critiques of the descent of man, less so the origin of species. And so just to read what it writes here, right, that she kind of wants to push a certain critique of this sort of social Darwinianism, right, recognizing the neurological opium of the masses via evolutionary cognition in relation to sociogenic pressures falling from Fanon. So that's quite a lot going on there. But essentially, what she starts to argue is that, Frantz Fanon, utilizes some bits of sort of Lamarckian thinking in some of his work, right? Talking about how, beyond ontogeny in terms of the, the development of the individual in the species, right? Phenology, you also need a sort of development of how this individual develops in the social context, right? This sociogeny, right? And so he sort of sees this as a kind of add-on to evolutionary thinking in the sense that um, to put it in some simple terms, one of the things that Winter's interested in is how behaving in certain ways, othering people, right, being othered, She talks about the passages of Fanon when, he's talking about where to sit on the train car, right? One of these famous ones, right? What it means, am I that name kind of thing? Like when someone calls you, one of these slurs, like what does that do to your sort of nervous system? In the sense of like, and then how is this treatment of being othered in this way become sort of biologically ingrained, or it kind of cuts into the way in which people want to treat others, what it means to be treated that way. Right? It's not so therefore it's not merely a kind of social constructivist um, way of reading the difference and othering and the violence of this, but that these violences become basically addictive in different ways. Right? This is the idea that this kind of becomes a sort of neurological opium of the masses in order to buy in to these, stereotypes and violences, doing them against others, right? It becomes a sort of drug, essentially, right? And so this is where she starts to kind of tap into some of these biological arguments, talking about pain, pleasure, reward systems, right? Cognitive science, and saying, this doesn't undermine all the other kind of aspects of her work, but rather the biological aspects of this thinking kind of undergirds even these supposedly normative or literary constructions, right? So, and that kind of connects to the final theme, right? Or sorry, there's two more. So, I mean, basically this idea, just to go back, so this idea of post-Darwin sociality, it kind of ties to this idea that the stories that we like, or, to go to myth, right? The myth we construct maybe have nothing to do with truth or even of a, you know, uh, really valued sense of meaning, but rather it might be about the stories that make us, and who is us is the question, feel good, basically. And so that becomes something that she really starts to explore in great detail. And so, at the same time, she starts to kind of do this genealogy of this figure of man, which I already mentioned, which I'll go into more in a bit. All right, so this notion, she sort of, goes more Foucault than Foucault, right? In the sense that, she thinks Foucault and the genealogical critique, right, looking at, how things are treated as things that must be, but in fact, maybe they're just things that sort of, they're not really built on any, higher than human meaning, or they're not universal, right? The idea that there's a sort of Eurocentric bias, even in Foucault's kind of critique, in his genealogies of madness and the clinic and, the hospital and all these things, right? And so she thinks that this figure of man, which changes over time, right, which I'll talk about in a second, this changing figure of man kind of changes the very way you can do genealogies from each kind of era to the next. So you think you have to sort of do a genealogy on how you do genealogies as well. And so, she thinks this shift, for instance, between the kind of Christian moral universe, um, which, the kind of origins of genealogy in Nietzsche are very familiar, but that once you shift beyond this to this kind of more biological understanding of man, right, in place of the human, that the same kind of genealogies aren't going to work. And I can talk more about that in detail. So then this kind of last theme, which is the one that's probably most relevant to the course, and connects to the last two, is this idea of humans as narrative beings, humans as storytelling beings, right? So this idea of homo narrans, she talks about it. Right? So that humans are ultimately homo narrans, right, who generate various normative systems. She uses the Wittgensteinian forms of life, right, to autopoetically instantiate and defend their origin myths as natural. So this builds, on the previous two, but especially on this question of the opium, the myths we have is the ones that make us feel good, right? So the fact is that, the argument that she makes is, humans are naturally storytelling, right? Which is kind of the interesting, complex thing that she emphasizes, and other people have talked about this too, right? The idea that if humans are the biological creatures which, make stories about things. And so, many of those stories, right, narratives or myths, and like what's the difference is kind of going to be a constant question. Again, maybe they're not meant to be true. Maybe they're the ones that make us, the group who is writing them, feel good or feel superior or or what, right? And so again, and not only does this have a sort of social cohesive function, right? A sort of anthropological, folklorish, right? Community normativity kind of function. But again, because of this biological aspect, right, it becomes a kind of certain forms of them become addictive and ingraining. And then on top of that, right, this is where they become kind of meta-biological, is that once we then recognize which stories let us feel and behave a certain way, you know, they sort of persist or they're invented, with the knowledge that they make a certain group feel superior, right? This kind of a biological addiction, this kind of reward punishment system um, becomes intentionally deployed as a kind of narcotic in a sense. And I think you could make an argument there. I think that this is one of the, you know, um, I mean, this is a question about whether that's one of the more persistent features of something like fascism, for instance, right? This outgroup dynamic, um, you know, in place of dealing with people's real material conditions, instead is about, right, no, blame X, right? Because that will immediately make you feel better about hating somebody, and protect another class without really doing any of the hard work, right? So that's sort of one instance of this, right? And then the even more complex thing, which is a big aspect of the course, is to ask, once we're aware of this fact, once we're aware that people do this or groups do this, what do you do with that fact, right? Can you just say no more myths, right? Like we're not going to do myths anymore? Or are they so, or narratives, which seems impossible. And this also goes to, on the one hand, but the quote by Bataille, right, that, you know, the only true myth is, right, that there is no myth. Or into Winter's point, like there's always going to be a new myth, right? People are going to find one even if you try to banish them. So how do you engineer one? Um, how do you engineer one that's actually politically good, or that's actually like universal in the broadest possible sense? And I think that's like a big question in her most recent works, which are mostly interviews, um, that she's done in the last few years. So you know, that's my sort of very sketchy overview of all of like the themes in Winter's work, with none of the details, of course. And she has very impressive, interesting details in basically everything she writes. So one aspect of this myth making, as I already mentioned, is these figures of man. Right? And so one way to see these is they're kind of like, you can see them as paradigms, right? Or there's, they're kind of, I mean, they are myths. They are myths, but they're myths that are not often explicitly named as such, because they're sort of these kind of undergirding, like the general thought structure of like the European mind. It would be one way to put it, right? So she gives various. So she says there's sort of man, and there's sort of man, man one and man two, and then the kind of question is, what's the next possibility? and of course, right, she's saying, man is again, right, it's standing in place of the human as if they are the same, right? And of course, Winter doesn't think they're the same, but right, that's the way it keeps getting used. So with kind of the first form of man, right, she just calls it man. She doesn't call it man zero. I just think it's a little bit more clear to put the zero there. Is this notion of essentially like the sort of European consciousness, European existence as being one of a sort of, at the center of a Christian cosmology, right? So, what Europeans think humans are, right, in the name of man, right, is, the sort of God created, right, center of the universe that, has, this kind of Christian mission to sort of, remake the world according to the powers and freedoms and rationality and everything that God has given them. Right. So this is essentially the world view as historically recorded in Europe up until the end of the Middle Ages, essentially. Right. And so this notion is, of course, very powerful in some ways, but it also leaves a lot of unopened questions once you encounter various forms of the other, right? Because otherness might be, in some ways, might be determined more by religiosity, right, than by geography or by, what we would understand as race, right, or culture, right? So everything building off of this Christian cosmology creates a different, the sort of notion of otherness, the notion of the kinds of stories being written is going to look quite different than what we would see, nowadays. And so part of the shift, right, one of the things that Winter argues, like why the Renaissance, and this is again going back to her point where she doesn't do the kind of standard crit theory or sometimes standard postmodern thing of critiquing like, meta discourses as just bad. Or, as, even in all these big shifts in the construction of the figure of man, they do open new possibilities, even for non-European others, just as they continue their violence, but in a different way against them. So it's never like a straightforward, um, you know, the sort of these things don't really emerge in exactly a sort of purposeful or completely purposeful way. There's a series of accidents that also, that are also sort of driven to sort of serve, right, this kind of Western centrism or sort of, white superiority in various ways. And the other, so the shift from man zero or from man to man one is the shift from like the medieval Christian cosmology to the sort of basically to the Renaissance, right? To the Renaissance thinking. And one of the, figures that she uses to talk about this, right, is this notion of, or the figure of Prospero, right, in Shakespeare's Tempest. And she's written, she has a really somewhat scandalous essay about it, which we can talk about later in the class if people are interested. But she sees, right, Prospero recognizes this figure of this kind of transition point, right? Because, Prospero was sort of kicked out, right, of his standing, right, to an island, and then through a series of accidents and then a lot of manipulation on his part, including, right, turning his daughter into a bargaining chip, uh, essentially goes from being a powerful magician to renouncing magic, right? To renouncing the old world of medieval superstition to becoming like a proper man of statecraft, right? So he breaks his his wand, his scepter, and he kind of gives up, he sort of exhausted magic and realized, the manipulation of people and their fears and making promises and all this kind of statecraft. This is the real thing. And of course, using his daughter marries her and himself back into power, essentially. Right. So the other sort of important for those who looked at the text or who know Winter's work, right, the other kind of points that she shows here, there's of course Columbus's encounter with the, so-called New World. Right? Again, this idea about myths and geographies and how this, plays into this kind of thinking. But also, right, this, sort of religious debate, right, between like Las Casas and between Las Casas and Sepulveda about, the status of the Amerindian people, right? Can we justify enslaving them, basically? With one side arguing, no, because, they sort of have, um, they have Christian, they have souls. We can't, they count as human in the, in this sort of old sense, right? In the sort of religious sense of the world, they count as people. With the other side arguing, well, no, they must be natural slaves in the sort of, other old model, right? Because of their sort of, lack of rationality. And so this debate, rages about, can we justify this or not? And in the end, the Spanish just use slaves from Africa instead, right? So the economic and, devaluation of certain peoples more than others kind of serves as an escape anyway. But part of Winter's point is that like the fact that these kinds of debates happened, right, in this period of man one, in this kind of Renaissance period, right, kind of shows how the figure of man has shifted or is starting to shift, right, rather than being sort of religiously determined, it starts to move towards, right, it starts to move towards the capacities of the human according to different measures that might not be religious. They might start to be political, and strategic measures, right? Without the kind of Christian universe playing any role in this anymore. So then the sort of period that will be most important for this class, right, is the kind of movement into sort of man two. And this is essentially, already mentioned some aspects of this, because this is essentially the kind of social Darwinian model, right? So this is the kind of industrial, right? We've moved away from the sort of Renaissance ideals and into this notion of the human, not about a kind of statecraft that borrows from Christianity when it feels like it, not from this Christian cosmology that's even older, but rather human, homo economos, right? This idea of the human is a, economic, competitive, right, social being. And so this whole idea about maximizing profit, right, this idea of the human is, becomes more animal-like in certain ways. But then, right, the sort of persistence of white supremacy or Eurocentrism, sort of rigs the game, right? Sort of forgets the contingency at the heart of Darwinism and instead emphasizes, right, the later works and those who would say, okay, something like evolution exists, but it must be progressive, actually. It must have a direction. There must be a ladder of evolution. There must be a progressive sense of evolution in which some people are more evolved than others. Some people, therefore, are more animal-like than others. So, right, we can still keep the sort of supremacy even in this logic as well, but the story changes a little bit, right? You have the sort of properly or almost properly secular version, right, of this construction of man as, yeah, the sort of the most evolved, right, in the sense of misreading evolution is rather than being what it's actually about, right, contingent events leading to adaptations to very local conditions, rather to assume, oh, evolution applies in a general sense and there's more evolved uh, uh, bodies and people. And once that fails, right, once pseudoscientists and sometimes, real biologists who are just very biased, failed to sort of assume there was degeneration or recapitulation or all these things, which I can talk about at length if anybody wants to know about them, how they work, right? Then they sort of shift, this progressive evolutionary logic to the mind, right? Well, it's like, okay, well, okay, we're not biologically different, maybe, but there's but technologically, culturally, right? European, this is the most advanced because look, we sort of made the world in this one image. And right, this very much points to Winter's whole point, right? Is saying this is the overrepresentation, right? The overrepresentative function of, this idea of man, right? In that, you know, they're taking a particular construction of the human from a particular history, right? And saying, right, it's the universal one, right? Which again is like, as I said, sounds like it may be a typical postmodern critique, but in Winter's notion, right, like the depths of this go, much farther than people realize. Right. So then, as I mentioned in these most recent works of Winter, these interviews in particular, um, is where, she says, okay, then the question is what's next? Right. And the whole point is she doesn't want man three, right? She says we don't need another overrepresentation. Rather, you need the human. Like how do we have a set of myths or narrative that's actually about the human that doesn't just fall into another, inflation of a particular type of human expression and culture and history that thinks it's, the measuring stick for all others, right? How do you avoid this? And of course, that's a very difficult question, right? Like that's not by any means a straightforward task. And many, or maybe, quite a few of the works on Winter's work, right, sort of Winterian scholarship, as we want to call it, has kind of tried to address this uh, in various ways. I think the book, pictured here, Jackson's book, is one of the better ones, I would argue, along with McKittrick's work. But at the same time, you see a lot of people falling into the kinds of traps that Winter herself, I think, wants to avoid, where people try to claim that Winter is a post-human thinker, or she's a thinker of the inhuman, or she gets critiqued by some feminist materialist thinkers as being, too much of a humanist, you know, because she's talking about figures like man, or she's talking about the human so much. Um, I think the response to that is pretty easy. As Winter's whole point is, we've never seen the human, right? We've only seen all these inflated stand-ins for it, right? We've never actually seen the human by which we could actually have a proper humanism. So in that sense, I think she's much more, she is a humanist of a kind, but I think you have to say she's kind of a critical humanist, or something to this regard, right? She doesn't fall into these other more recent developments, but she's not just a humanist either. I think that would be a sort of a gross misrepresentation of her work, to say that. Yeah. So this is where we kind of get to the particular um, we get to sort of the particular content of the course, right? And where I think Winter's work is really interesting, in looking at the sort of present, and this whole problem of myths and this problem of science and of, disinformation and all these kinds of things that we're maybe sick of hearing about, in certain contexts more than others. But what I sort of want to argue is that, and Winter says this herself, but she doesn't really go into great detail about it from what I know, is, of course, she talks about these transitions, right, from man to man one to man two to whatever's next. But of course, as she points out at least once, but I think more than that, this isn't like a clean shift, right? Like when you go from the Christian, right, you go from the Christian, metaphysical kind of worldview, to the, more secular but still religious, right, Renaissance one. Of course, you don't get rid of, you don't lose all the baggage, right? the story has changed, but some of the things from the older paradigm or regime or whatever you want to call it remains. And so part of the hard work is to understand what remains and what doesn't, what is sort of old, old wine in new bottles kind of stuff, and what is really new about the shift. Because what is new in the shift can, of course, create some unexpected resistance, right, to the old things. And so I think that's part of what I'm interested in the course, because I think, in particular, the theme that I want to look at, right, this sort of, this white world, or this idea of all these mythical lands that are so baked by so many people for so many decades, um, that are so baked in like some kind of white suprematism or Euro suprematism, or however you want to work that the difference between those out. So much of that is, of this myth making, I think, is based upon types of thinking that sort of try to work around or ignore these big shifts from like man to man one to man two. So I think part of the idea is that this kind of myth making, I think, is a sort of, that's why I sort of talked about it as it's kind of like a political unconscious in a way. That it's, why do these particularly weird, outlandish stories persist more than others? And I think in part is because they keep a thread all the way through these kinds of big shifts that Winter talks about, or maybe not. And I think that's one of the big questions of the course. Like, is this weird stuff singular in its weirdness each time it happens? Or what does it mean to say there's a persistent, um, thought process or bias? Bias doesn't seem to be adequate enough, right? What is the right word to use there? Okay, so some bits of this kind of, I don't know if counter history is the right word, but the sort of history of this resistant of the movement of paradigms, or however we want to call it. I need to think of a better term for it. So, I could say it's about the resilience of racism, with, with and against science at the same time. So one example, right? There was, of course, lots of discoveries of indigenous archaeological sites in the US, right, all through the 1700s and 1800s. And of course, lots of records of this also going back much older in the Americas from, the conquistadors and others, right? But when certain types of things get discovered, or the reaction to certain types of discoveries in the Americas, later, right? So here is one of these famous earthworks in the Midwest, right? And discovered in the 1830s, with, of course, people rightfully attributing them to various indigenous peoples in the region. The problem is there's still open debate about which groups made them when. They think a lot of these earthworks were like meeting places, or maybe a marketplace where people from lots of different cultures would come together and meet, um, because of their size and because of the archaeological traces they found, this kinds of things. So this seems very interesting, right? Interesting discoveries. But then you get certain wild reactions, which might seem like they're very fringe, but these are actually more popular than the sort of, straightforwardly scientific reactions to these discoveries. So you have this figure, Josiah Priest. I doubt anyone's heard of him, but he writes this book about these discoveries, right? And Priest, so this is what I mean by kind of borrowing from older paradigms to sort of challenge the new one in various ways, right? Is that he sort of claims, well, no, obviously, and of course he's openly racist in his justifications. He doesn't even try to hide it, as some people did, even at that time, polite language or euphemisms or something. But he says, no indigenous peoples could have constructed this. So clearly there must have been, and this is how he borrows from the kind of older stories, or he borrows from biblical record, to put, record in scare quotes, and says, oh, there must have been a great flood, and these are traces of an older, right, European-like civilization. Right. So this is a strategy that we will see over and over again, and I'm really curious, like the sort of, it's not only psychology, but the sort of way in which this is constructed and why it's so effective. And still now, like we see this like today all the time, is that, so whether it was in the Christian cosmological world, whether it was in the kind of statecraft, Renaissance thinker world, whether it's in the socialist Darwinian, capitalist hyperlogic kind of world, there was in every sense, right, an attempt to make white European identity older than it was, right? And so this is very important. And even though, in like the biological, the social Darwinian stuff, that becomes very complicated to do, right? So you have to say, oh, how can whiteness be the oldest but the most evolved? And they go through some very twisted logics to try to do this, which I can talk about. But in this case, in the case of Josiah Priest, right, he just takes, the Bible's authority and sort of undoes, right, this kind of man-to kind of construction of, proper history and things like this. Um, and so, he writes all kinds of atrocious text, defends the institution of slavery in the US outright. And just, constantly devalued and attacked Native peoples, and wrote work that was hugely influential, hugely inflammatory. And so what I find very interesting is when you read stuff about people like Josiah Priest, they'll often say, oh, he's like not an important figure. Like so many of the figures that we will encounter are like um, basically school dropouts who got really mad and just like wrote a bunch of really racist stuff. And it sort of struck me that, but like, they didn't have any money or influence, but people were so enamored by their ideas that it didn't really matter, which back then is even kind of surprising in some of the instances. But at the same time, it sort of struck me that this sounds an awful lot like, maybe it's too cheesy to say, but it almost feels like, podcasting. It feels like the sort of 19th century version of, well, these ideas were so, people were so enamored with, again, this point of Winters, right? Makes us, the in-group, feel so good. It's so effective, regardless of how patchy and conspiratorial and illogical it is. Has the most intense feeling, and that's what really matters. And so I think this is also something to think about in terms of how that changes historically or not. There was always this non-institutional allure of these kinds of things. So another kind of trend in this, and this will also be quite a big part of the class, right, is that we have, towards the end of the 19th century, we have all the sort of culmination and synthesis of a lot of spiritualist practices, right? A lot of, again, non-institutional, we could say non-institutional religious practices, right? Or, excuse me, religious practices attempting to be modern in some ways, right? To address industrial life, but to also benefit from the second wave of colonialism, right? As Victorian colonialism, but also keep alive, right? Again, this is borrowing from across the paradigms, some kind of feeling of spiritual, transcendence. And so you have one of the culminations of this is this kind of notion of theosophy, right? Which is associated with a few different figures, but like Blavatsky being one of the most famous ones. So, she's someone who, I mean, her biography reads like a conspiracy theory itself almost. Sort of enamored with the Far East. Again, what that means based on where you're from changes in terms of the imaginary, right? Uh, studying sort of Eastern practices, whatever she claims that is, making up fake documents by people who never existed, writing books that stole and borrowed from fiction and from philosophy and from religion and from other people, right? And creating this movement of essentially, right? I mean, really what it is a sort of modern religious movement or a kind of new spiritualist movement. And that, right, borrowing from old spiritualism, right, the idea of like that modern technology has maybe given us a peek into the world of spirits or, access to the dead and these kinds of things. That no, maybe there's even an older, right? Again, this idea of inventing an even older past to justify certain kinds of supremacy. There's maybe even an older religious tradition or an older tradition by which all religions are just a sort of devolved form of. So again, right, just like anytime some white European dude discovers some ruins that his brain can't handle and has to invent like, oh, well, this is just like the ruins of Atlanteans, or this is ruins of someone greater from before. You have essentially the spiritual version of this in many ways, right? There's always some older spiritual construction. And you look at the theosophical texts and you will see people try to defend it and say, oh, well, it's not racist because it's about spirit, not materiality. But, when you kind of look, this whole idea of like root races, right? You look at all this idea at the bottom there that there's the Lemurians, the Atlanteans, the Hyperboreans, right? All that there's these original races, but they're not defined by, their flesh, but defined by their capacity. And of course, those with the most technological or advanced capacity or the most pure religious ideas happen to be, where do you think? They tend to correspond to Europe, but with the little twist of theosophy, which even the Nazis carried on strangely, right? They include, you know, the Tibetans and some people from India in the category of whiteness, spiritually speaking. So this also creates a whole interesting way of constructing suprematism that is not visually marked, which is very convenient, of course, right? When you can talk about there's Aryan appearance on the one hand, but what really matters is Aryan, characteristics, right? So this fluidity, um, benefits a lot of what will come soon after, right? And so, this idea of Lemuria or this kind of fantastical constructions of the earth, on top of this, right, is obviously, even if they again claim these sort of racialized, they claim it's sort of not about physical characteristics, it's about these dispositions, and these dispositions are nevertheless connected to geography. So you kind of get this kind of suprematist argument, but one that can't be challenged in any empirical scientific way because it's all derived from this always older tradition. And not only that, but this tradition, this theosophical tradition, only certain people can even access the data, right? Only certain people can read the texts, express them, and so on. By the way, this was also not surprisingly inspiration for Mormonism, right? Which in Mormonism, you see the exact same logic, right? Ooh, I secretly found a secret thing that only an angel could read and dictate to me, right? This whole kind of like layers of accessibility denial, and making ever ancient civilizations, right? Just, rewriting the history of the Native Americans to justify the Mormon Church and so on, right? It's the same logic, just a sort of localized form. But this is very persistent. And so after, Blavatsky, she writes like these kinds of massive texts and does lots of tours and does quite spreads and converts quite a lot of people. It kind of splits, right? The sort of movement splits famously, with Annie Besant's kind of taking it in a more sort of more like a hyper religious direction in a way, right? Kind of taking control of the Theosophical Society, and pushing it, and also or what's interesting about Besant, and I think this is also relevant for the course as it applies to the present, is that a lot of people who got invested in theosophy and the new spiritualist movements, many of them started out as political figures or political agents, and then abandoned these politics to do theosophy, which of course they still did politics, but they didn't claim they were anymore. And I think this is again a move we're probably very familiar with, right? That these, appealing to this older tradition, making you kind of ultra traditionalist in some kind of sense, allows you to be political without appearing like you're political, because the thing you're connected to is more ancient than ancient, right? It's a spiritual, you see a lot of this kind of stuff in the fascist yoga kind of connections, right? Like you're just sort of doing a practice in connection to these old, always older things. It can't be cultural appropriation. No, it can't be bad history. No, it's more ancient than ancient, right? You can't even look in a Bible, right? The Bible is secret, or maybe there never was one. And then the other split that comes after Blavatsky dies is you get Rudolf Steiner, who is probably more familiar to people, right? There's still Steiner schools in the country I'm sitting in right now. And he sort of brings, right, this theosophical ideas sort of more close to the human, right, and kind of makes this kind of anthroposophy, right, this kind of idea of really focusing on the human and spiritualizing human bodily practices, right, these very Volkish ideas of like good health and good exercise being a kind of spiritualist kind of mode, right? And those kinds of notions, I mean, people will often point out that Steiner was persecuted by the Nazis, but when you look into the details, the persecution was, a bit like their persecution of, the Marxists. They're like people whose ideas are going to make ours look bad. We want to get rid of first. And so, the Nazis had a lot of the same Volkish kinds of practices as Steiner did, but they wanted to, they sort of saw anything that was too occult. They wanted to get rid of it because they wanted to control the occult thing, right? You can't have other people saying they have ancient knowledge, right? If you want to have control of that, and like, rewrite medical practices and all these kinds of things in Nazi Germany, which is what they did, right? To sort of subvert the university, work around it, and create these kinds of esoteric practices, which were sort of people pleasing and fed into their own fantastical, worldview. And so this will slowly lead us to some of the texts that we're reading, right? The theosophical thinking, as I said, is very much based and very much pulls a lot from this notion of the Far East, which was sometimes regardless of country. Sometimes it meant India, sometimes it meant Tibet, sometimes it meant nowhere that actually existed, but in the neighborhood. So I put this painting by Roerich, which is a famous one, right? Kind of showing these kinds of landscapes, right? This kind of fabled places, these maybe non-existent homes of, great wisdom in the kind of mystical Far East. And then even the colors themselves are chosen to represent theories of emotion and value in theosophy. So, right, blue is kind of holy. That's why everything is kind of blue. And I pick this painting in particular, again, and this will sort of lead us into some of the other theories and ways of thinking in the course, is because that painter is explicitly referenced by H.P. Lovecraft's characters in At the Mountains of Madness. And so I sort of mentioned, this might seem like totally out of left field, but you see a lot of similar themes, and this idea of this sort of unexplored places, or these places that were seen as special and important to esoteric thinking. So like in Lovecraft's case, right, the sort of extreme poles of the planet, where everything looks like, these theosophical painters, these impossible architectures, right? You have the same kind of logic of things that no human could construct, right? Or no, native human from this place could construct. With, entangled with stories of, mixed breeding, right? Miscegenation, and then also, the sort of added twist that Lovecraft didn't invent, which we'll talk about, but also ties into a lot of this stuff, right? Is this kind of alien astronaut kind of things, right? So this is the even more extreme kind of conspiratorial version of, the Mayans or the Aztecs or the Egyptians or whoever couldn't have done this on their own, right? They must have had help from aliens. Or, the peoples from these regions that the Theosophists talked about, like Hyperborea or Lemuria or whatever, right? They were like, they were alien-like in some way, right? So they were also superior, right? So then again, the same logic, even when you involve aliens, right? It still somehow leads back to white supremacy. Surprise. So there's this kind of logic, these kinds of weird logics at work, which we'll see a lot, right? So one of them, this in Theosophy, right, is the achievements of the East, broadly defined, are due to a magical help, while indigenous peoples of the West are seen as degradations of more ancient white-coated human beings and or the interventions of aliens, right? This is due to the fact that European history could not adequately dehistoricize the former, but could deny the historical being of the latter, right? So think about this, right? Like the New World, right? There was this real sense of Europeans landing in the Americas and thinking that the world was not only new because of what it was discovered later, you know, by discovered in scare quotes, right, by Columbus, but also that there was thinking that the Americas actually emerged much later than Europe. And so there's this like widespread assumption by even quite respected biologists in the 1800s that thought that there could be no animals bigger in the Americas than in Europe because they hadn't had time to get big enough. Like this was like a real thing where then, I think it was Jefferson or someone actually sent like the skull of a moose or something to Cuvier to say like, fuck you, like look, like, you know, Lewis and Clark didn't believe bears were as big as all the indigenous people told them, right? Like you're gonna die. You're gonna get, they didn't believe them. Um, so like this again, logic is very deep and went on for a really long time. But of course, so because the Europeans couldn't deny, or there was like not possibility for whatever reasons to deny the age of right this Far Eastern construction, they sort of made it into like a magical thing, right? So they also dehistoricize it, but like in a different way, right? They sort of nullify it, them as historical agents, like whether it's India, whether it's again Tibet, whether it's parts of China, right? They have to sort of fall out of the discourse in some way or another. So this is a bit of a stupid, maybe stupid, silly thing. I sort of call this the El Dorado Kunlun spectrum, right? So the idea that, the Europeans had to sort of invent these places that didn't exist in different ways, right? El Dorado being like, they couldn't believe that indigenous peoples in the Americas could treat gold such in a way. So there must be some like, insane source of gold that they all could easily get to, right? So they must be like naive, right? This like naive childishness kind of applied, and the myths that come out of that. And on the other hand, right, Kunlun or like the various, and you see this, right, even if you watch Marvel films, right, you can't escape the persistence of this kind of myth making, right? That yes, there are secret, powerful magics in the East, places, Shangri-La, all this kind of stuff, whatever, there's so many versions, right? That's how Batman learned, Batman learned stuff, right? From them. Like it doesn't, it's all the way to now, you still see the traces of it. Um, and so like they have this magical, right, mystic, right? The mystic arts comes from this place. And so it's like this kind of magical, special place that only, you know, uh, proper, brave or whatever Westerners can sort of tap into. And, you even had the Nazis, right, sent archaeological research trips to Tibet, I mean, these are like one of the wildest photos you can see if you've ever seen them, thinking there might be some, Aryan connection there, right? So it's very consistently weird, to put it that way. Okay, so in a similar way, right, sort of kind of, let me see actually how far before we take a little break. Yeah, maybe go for like another like 5-10 minutes and we take like a short break. I guess we'll be about halfway. Um, so in a similar fashion, right, to this kind of geographical construction, we have this kind of construction of race, right, in the same way. And so the construction of race was never a materialistic reduction, but rather a spiritual essentialism that could be tethered more or less strongly to physical characteristics, depending upon the colonial, pseudoscientific, or governmental need at hand. Right? So this applies to several different things I've mentioned. Again, right, something like Aryanness, right, not being really about appearance, but being about qualities, right? The same reason why, when the Nazis or before them, right, in North America, setting up various eugenics laws, right? They always involved qualities that they knew weren't, I mean, you can't even say genetic because they didn't even know the genetics then well. But they just set up qualities which were just, vague and broad because then they could, of course, challenge anyone in court and then sterilize them, which is what they did. Right. So the fact of qualities or dispositions, right, being vague and broad makes them more weaponizable. Right. The same with race. Like even in the social Darwinian period, this kind of Man-2 period of winter, right? In terms of, for instance, blackness, right? It wasn't that, or even in the specific context of African Americans, for instance, right? They were seen as more human or more animal, depending on the context, right, of the political weaponization. So, for instance, all these racist claims by the Nazis, but also by plenty of North Americans who said, oh no, Jesse Owens or whoever can't compete in the Olympics because they're too strong, they're too powerful because they're more animal-like, right? At the same time, you have the same people saying or being completely fine with experimenting on African Americans in particular, for decades and decades and decades. And in that case, they were perfectly human enough, right? So, and this is something that Jackson in her book discusses at length, right? The line between human and animal and how it, is stuck on top of race shifts according to convenience and to political opportunism, basically. All right. So to say it's like a materialist reduction or that it's reductive isn't quite adequate. And so just as another example, and this kind of goes back to this notion of aesthetics that Winter talks about, and also this, you can also see this as the kind of limits of the kind of original construction of man zero, whatever, as you have this period in the Middle Ages where whiteness gets invented, right? In the sense that even if you just look at the art, right, white Europeans go from being like pinkish brown to being white, like actually like alabaster white. And this obviously didn't like why did this happen? It wasn't like a historical event in the sense that suddenly everyone got, in Europe got brighter or something on their skin. It's of course corresponds largely with the Crusades, right? And so why? You have to associate skin color with these qualities, with some other quality to justify it, right? Because the racial logic didn't quite exist in the same way, right, for the Christian, moral universe. And so, how do you, case in point, how do you allow a bunch of paladins and other religious Christian soldiers to kill people with impunity, right? You're not supposed to murder people if you're a good Christian. Well, they have to not count as people in some way. So what is it? They're not committing homicide, right? They're not these religious warriors are not killing another person, another human, another man. They're killing, or it's not even killing. They're destroying evil. So it's malicide. It's not homicide. Thank you, Pope, whatever. Like so that construct. So then of course corresponding with that, the skin color becomes associated with, certain qualities of this religious logic, right? But it's a very different notion of race, right, than what we will see later. But nevertheless, right, this sort of aesthetic component is a sort of workaround to a sort of cosmological or biblical creationary, however you want to say, problem. And you get a similar thing with this, with the logic of, this notion of other twistings of biblical logic to justify race. And these ones persist even after the shift into the, Man two, right, into the 18th and 19th century. And Joseph Priest, the guy I mentioned, who sort of said that the earthworks or the mounds, of indigenous people couldn't have been made by them. He also promoted this theory, right? And this theory is to sort of read a tiny bit of the Bible, to say that, oh, people who were kicked out, people who are in parts of Africa are the descendants um, people who were marked by Cain. Either they were descendants of Cain, who was kicked out of Eden, or more popularly, they were the descendants of Ham, right? Of this sort of figure who is sort of cursed, but even biblical scholars don't even know if it counts as a curse. Like it's even for biblical evidence, it's like wildly flimsy, even if you take it as a historical record, which is another issue. So they sort of read this and say, well, okay, this is how, even if we're all one species, right? Because before, of course, because if you were a good Christian, you had to believe in Adam and Eve, and you had to believe, therefore, that people from other races weren't of a different species, which some, secular people could believe in their racism. But if you say, okay, well, if you're a good Bible thumper, then you had to sort of find a way to justify this, and so you did it this way, right? You say, oh, well, they're descendants of like some of the bad original humans, right? And so this is another sort of racist workaround that was very common. And actually, anyone who watched Lovecraft Country, there was bits of this in there. They talk about this kind of this bit of myth making in there somewhat. And then, of course, right, to in terms of talking about this construction of race and in the sort of logic of the kind of post-Darwinian period, right, you have this anthropological, right, again, this is the human-animal connection, right, being used and weaponized against people outside of Europe, claiming, that they were more like, so they correspond to different kinds of animals, even though if you accept Darwin, right, you also can't use the different species argument, so you have to do this like more or less evolved argument or more or less human argument, right, to try to break Darwinism while still looking like a secular thinker. And I mean, I can talk about that quite at length if people are interested. But this also builds a lot upon, right, this very flimsy, weak anthropological record, right, which of course is built itself upon a lot of basically what's travel writing. I mean, that makes it sound nice, which it's not, obviously. In terms of text like by Gobineau, this inequality of the human races, right? And this is the civilization kind of culture argument, right? Like people from here can only do this, right? So this is, though older than Darwin, this one is one that persists post-Darwin also, right? So it's like technological or artistic capacities are sort of seen as the test of how evolved, in scare quotes, you are, while at the same time, right, you have these fantasies and constructions of whiteness that sort of disallow any ancient actual constructions of technological advancement to count, because no, they couldn't have done them, right? So it's sort of like assuming the case and then using this cultural logic where the game has already been rigged. Okay. Yeah, maybe we take a short break there, I think is a good time. It's been an hour and a half. So should we say, I never know if people want to do 10 or 15? People have desires.
Yeah, maybe
Let's do
15
10. 15.
or
Okay,
10.
15.
Sorry.
Okay, we can do how about we do a strict 15? So actually everyone back at 45, yeah? Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So let me slides. Mhm.
Ben, we're recording again. You can
Yeah.
start.
Okay. Can people see the slides still, or did they disappear? Yeah. Okay.
They're there. Mhm.
Okay. So yeah. So I don't have too much to go through more. So this. So of course, as I mentioned, right, this idea of the sort of way of constructing race in this period, right, in the kind of 1900s. But there's, of course, you have these sort of biblical or mythological or other ways of trying to work around it in various ways. And then, right, you sort of have with Origin of Species in particular, right, this idea of, if you want to sort of have this secular reason of claiming that there's some kind of inequality or material difference, right, between human beings, then you sort of have to do these kind of weird workarounds which kind of violate Darwinism in a different way. And so that's why this period, the sort of decade after Darwin publishes The Origin of Species until about the 1920s, is called the eclipse of Darwinism, partially because you have lots of people who agree with aspects of evolution, of Darwinian evolution. And there is a sort of single, evolution occurs, right? Changes in species occur. There's common ancestors, right? There's maybe one common universal ancestor. But one of the things that people resist the most heavily is this notion of contingency, right? So the idea that evolution could just be a series of accidents, right? That it could just be the result of these accidents is right seen as sort of a bridge too far, essentially. And so this is why you have different attempts at creating things like orthogenesis, right? The idea that evolution occurs, but it has a direction, right? It goes towards complexity. It sort of, advances in some kind of logical form. You have people who, right, different, sort of trying to mix Darwinian or oppose or mix Darwinian evolution with Lamarckianism of different kinds, right? There's inherited traits or environmental conditions play more of a role. And then, of course, like and then, of course, you have these people who also try to push this notion of recapitulation, right? This idea that um, there is, right, they sort of accept, yes, humans evolved from non-human animals. There's shared ancestry, but that the idea that this doesn't necessarily only go in one direction. Right? So the idea is that evolution there can be de-evolution, there can be degeneration, right? So things can go wrong, and you can have people who are more animal-like than others, right? And so you get, a lot of this is a way to sort of keep alive these kind of cultural logics of racism and colonialism, post-Darwinian materialism, if you want to say that. And some of the ways that you do this, you have this famous case of Samuel Morton, for instance, who attempts to sort of claim, right, that non-Europeans, right, or this theory of the races based on skull comparisons, and he measures like the weight and volume of skulls and claims that white Europeans could have like the biggest skulls, and therefore they have the most brain capacity, and this makes sense based on, or again, our technological and cultural achievements, by erasing, ones that wouldn't be attributed to indigenous peoples or non-white peoples in the Americas and elsewhere. And this is an sort of example of, they kind of move things just to sort of touch on the present a bit, right? In Stephen Jay Gould's The Mismeasure of Man, which is still one of the best texts about scientific racism, he sort of looks at Morton's work and he says, well, Morton probably, was biased. This is this thing I mentioned where this claim of bias in critiquing scientific racism doesn't usually go far enough, because it's like he was clearly biased. He was he was openly against, or he was openly supporting the like extermination of the Native Americans, for instance. And so Gould, posted this like wrote this very kind of, gentle but, well crafted critique of Morton's work. This is, 100 years later. And people like attacked Gould, calling him like a Marxist, and said, no, this couldn't be. You're politicizing science and all these kinds of things. And it wasn't until just a few years ago, it was actually revealed by some archival work that Morton explicitly doctored his work to prove people who would say there was an equality of the races wrong. So Gould was, if anything, too gentle on Morton and this like skull comparison work. And just to show, like the notion that there must, science is unbiased, and this, basically mostly racist people defending their racism by way of scientific neutrality. And even when it's shown that there was no scientific neutrality, they, sort of persist onwards. Or in the case of Jonathan Marks, who wrote this book, on human biodiversity, right? The term was supposed to put to rest scientific racism. This, written in the 90s. And of course, anybody who knows online discourse will know that that term became completely co-opted by the alt-right, right? So that sort of like becomes like a scientific, in scare quotes, way of justifying racial differences, right? So again, there's like something that is, which I think it's kind of mythic, basically. There's something that bias and like cultural racism doesn't even, there's something even deeper. There's an even deeper compulsion towards suprematism, in which it really has this kind of mythic character. Okay, so if people looked at the text for today, the winter one is quite massive and difficult. But why did I include the Lovecraft one, which maybe might have seemed strange at face, but hopefully, I hope it makes sense after the fact, right? It's not so much about what happens in the story, which not a lot happens, as in a lot of Lovecraft stories, but rather that the text, to me, the text is kind of a wonderfully dense, like laboratory for a lot of these kinds of ideas, right? These like literally almost every racist stereotype shows up to the museum. All these ancient lands and myths and the people who invented them are named. Some invented, some not, right? Which itself is kind of part of the game, right? Lemuria and Mu and all the authors that wrote all these texts, right? They all kind of show up in this Lovecraft text, which is, why I think it's such a good sort of background text to show how all these themes, like, this kind of fantastical stories, myth, white suprematism through geography, through justified pillage, like everything is there. I wrote an essay, about this in about Lovecraft in this regard, that he's some people have claimed, like I think Welbeck claimed, he's like, you almost can't call him a racist because he's like so racist that like goes beyond humanity or something. And I think rather it's more that he just combines every theme of racism like at once. And so he's actually really useful to read in showing the kind of hyperbolic reaction to the potential loss of like European cultural supremacy, which was like his biggest fear. Of all the things he constructed, he's very clear in his life, in his writings, that the thing he feared the most was, good culture going bad, essentially. And so in the story, right, a lot of the things that are mentioned will pop up here and there throughout the course, right? This text is often considered one of the first or one of the most formative texts. It's called Vril, Vril, The Coming Race by Edward Leighton. It's mentioned in Lovecraft's story, and it's really one of the first kind of, it's fiction, it doesn't claim to be anything else, but it's so compelling as creating this kind of fictional race, and that, there's more ancient white races, and all these kinds of themes are deployed so effectively that people took it, and by people I mean the theosophists, people like Blavatsky and others, took it to be true, right? Took it to be the case. And Leighton, even though he's writing explicitly fiction, is the inspiration for a lot of the people, again, who are also mentioned in the same breath as Leighton in Lovecraft's story, do these works that are called pseudo-archaeology, right? So Churchward, right, this lost continent of Mu, there was this kind of giant Polynesian-esque kind of country, right? That, of course, Oceania and all the countries that we know are just mere remnants, right? All these tiny islands are just remnants of this once older, greater civilization. Or Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, right? And again, with this antediluvian idea, you can see the connection to a priest that I mentioned, right, who sort of claims, right, who uses this, like, the biblical flood myth is kind of a keystone to sort of talk about all these geographies of forgotten great civilizations. And of course, he uses this to sort of place, Donnelly places Atlantis in, in Central America or somewhere near it. And for any Marvel fans, Donnelly's account of Atlantis is explicitly used in the second Black Panther movie, right? So this idea of Namor and his people being these like former indigenous people who sort of drowned but survived and created this civilization, right? It's borrowing heavily from Donnelly's Central Americanization of the Atlantis myth, right? So I think that's also something we should keep in mind throughout the course, is that a lot of these ideas, whether it's from pseudo-archaeology, there's often an attempt to detach them from their sort of racial or political qualities, but then they still persist as like an alluring imaginary. And I think there's a question of what's the politics of that. Yeah. And like another example of this, for instance, like the comic books Hellboy, which of course there's been several movies also, a lot of those texts take a lot of these themes of like Mu and Lemuria and all this kind of stuff, and tries to take out the bad politics. And so I think it's a question of what does that mean, that the sort of imaginary lives on without all the other associations? Is that even possible? Right, so we start to see, again, from Lovecraft's text, but also from the things I've mentioned, this alternative globe and this alternative view of Atlantis and of Mu and of Lemuria and Hyperborea in the north and all these other possibilities. This whole question of like, what does this, what does this mean? To me, it's like, what is the desire to go to these lengths? Why do the myths have to be constructed in this way? And then we have, a more recent example, or an example that's resurfaced, which we'll also look at in the course. And so all of these kinds of, so like Mu and Lemuria and all these ones we'll kind of look at, and then in relationship to different literary or philosophical texts. And also more recently, we have this like attempt to resurrect Tartaria. So if anyone is a real fan of exploring certain alt-right worlds, especially as they correspond to Russia, right? Alexander Dugin, who we'll look at, has also constructed again this sort of myth of sort of greater Russia coming from this old idea that is, pseudo-archaeological, pseudo-geographical, as well as, a strange theosophist kind of religious tone to it. And if you look, you don't have to look very hard to find discussion groups and very active online discussions of Tartaria and its political meanings and that kind of thing. So this is to sort of try to connect explicitly, right, all of these themes to to the present, right, as well as not being a course that seems only sort of stuck in the 19th century, hopefully. Okay, so that's the sort of presentation that I had for today. So there's some practicalities to talk about, but maybe if people have any questions or any comments about any of that before we sort of talk about the nuts and bolts. And yeah, you can speak the questions or in the chat is also fine. So someone's asking about my winter. Yeah, so this question about is Winter's genealogy kind of strategic essentialism? Yeah, I mean, I think that argument could be made. I mean, I think she does it in such a genealogically rich way that people think she's kind of like endorsing it. I think people almost miss the fact that Winter is being strategic. Like I said, she's accused of being too much of a humanist or being too modernist or something, which I find kind of funny if you've read most of her work. But yeah, I mean, I think that claim could definitely be made. But I think the question is, how does that relate to the fact that when she talks about these ruptures or like the complications that occur and shift from like man 1 to man 2, or for instance, in the shift from man to man 1, she has these, several texts about Christopher Columbus, right? And we might look at one of them, I think, towards the end of the class as kind of like sort of return to winter. She sort of says it's a catastrophe, but it also is a kind of modern catastrophe, right? There's something happens in that encounter that probably wouldn't have happened without this kind of ridiculously under-researched expedition, right? And so I think there's something, so I think she goes beyond the strategic essentialism, and that I think she's willing to sort of say that you can't even deny like the West as a purely negative construction, which I think, again, makes a lot of people uncomfortable. So yeah, I think depending on how you read strategic there, I think, yeah, it depends. And then there's also a question about myths being narcotic. Yeah, and about people being addicted to Instagram and things. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting that in some also like it's a more late turn for Winter. She does talk about like neural Darwinism. So she talks about like being addicted to certain things and like certain parts of the brain being like reshaped by these addictions. I mean, and she talks about it in very broad terms, right? Um, she often doesn't talk about certain topics that date her texts really, like being hyper specifically like contemporary or like mentioning something in pop culture, for instance. She does that sometimes, but very rarely. So I don't know what she would say about, being addicted to the internet. But I think it would fall into this kind of pleasure, punish, reward system, right? It's this idea that, um, I mean, to the point, right? The point that you end up, loving the stories that make you feel good. I mean, obviously you can see the algorithmic tunnel, right? As just, yeah, like a speed run version of that, right? The idea is that like, oh, you like this, how about 10,000 more versions of the same thing, right? So yeah, that seems to fall into the same kind of logic. Were there any other questions about any of the broad outline? So I mean, the point today, of course, is I hope to not talk this much every week, obviously, but I just wanted to set up the kind of broad themes of like myth and race construction um, and all these pseudo discourses, which I think are very important, right? Like pseudo archaeology, pseudo history, pseudoscience, right? These are like this is very much a course about, the like passion of the pseudo. I think is like another way you could sort of talk about the course. I mean, I can say like in terms of Instagram reels, I mean, if you are addicted or if you want to like if you love blasting through TikTok, there is a guy people probably heard of. He's incredibly popular called Minute Minuteman. His whole thing, I just put it in the chat. His whole thing is debunking pseudo archaeology. Like that's what he does to make money online. So I feel like that's kind of like a nice sort of side text to the course if you're interested, right? He sort of talks about a lot of this attempts to, you know, people claiming there's like generators under the pyramids and stuff like this. He's a professional debunker. But yeah, so any questions about the broad strokes or the point of the class, things like this, or specific questions about any of the themes I mentioned? Is it just too much of an information bomb?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned briefly that one of the topics of the course is sort of to find maybe not an answer, but at least to outline how can we actually get out of this mythological thinking, or at least how to like not fall back again into the same myths, or how to find an alternative to it while analyzing. So I would be very curious to hear your answer or your thoughts to this question, because I mean, I'm really concerned about it, as the very figure of debunking the myths is also a very European figure, I would say. So if we see Western philosophy, then seeing beyond the myths or finding the truth behind what is seen as pseudo can be considered as the one of the main motives of European philosophy and even science. So how would you imagine getting out of this idea of showing kind of the true light behind this darkness, so to say?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's not yeah, I don't think it's a question anyone can answer like offhand. It's very, and even Winter herself, right? She says we need a new myth, right? She says it explicitly. But we need like a universal myth, as opposed to like the fake universal ones, right? Like Western rationality being a universal, right? But if that only means, yeah, if rationality only means, yeah, that that has all this like Christian baggage and also has all this like culturally specific, limits to it, right? Then of course it's never going to be like a universal rationality in the way it claims to be. So yeah, I mean, people really don't like saying that we need a new myth. But I guess kind of the question is, yeah, is it possible to talk about the universal human? I talk about the human in a way that isn't immediately seen as, yeah, like secretly Western rationalist, like the kinds of things people say about Badiou, for instance, right? When he talks about truth and universalism. And Winter's the only kind of answer that I think is interesting, or the thing that I think I see in Winter that's interesting, is her strategy is very particular. Because her strategy is this kind of oscillation between the universal and the particular, basically, right? Or she calls it in very different terms. And she talks about the sort of demon, right? She talks about like the demon as in like the demon of the sciences, where you imagine like the biggest, right, furthest perspective you can think of on the one hand. And then she talks about the grounds, right? She talks about like from this particular place. So in McKittrick, Catherine McKittrick talks about this, right, a lot. She wrote a whole book about it basically. So I think the kind of question, and maybe it's too easy, but it's like if you created a universal notion of the human from every place, and then you looked at them, side by side, would there be something there? Is it possible to find a through line that would allow you to construct a myth about what the human could be? And like it seems like it should be possible, like in theory. But I think the problem is, I think calling it a myth means it also has to be like I think the important thing about a myth, right, is that it's not like true, or it might be true at some point, or it might become true in some way, but it's more that it's like it's a story that's motivating, right? It's a narrative that causes people to behave in a community in a certain way. And so the question is, could you make a universal myth? Could you like make a myth that motivates cross-culturally to do something? And it seems like we have things that are close to that, but they're mostly bad. Or like, like capital, or I don't know, you could pick things like this that are like almost universal in a sense. So it seems like it is possible to construct it, but it's like, is it possible to construct it intentionally? And I think that's like the really hard question, which I obviously don't know how to answer it. Because yeah, I think things seem so fragmentary that it's hard to imagine, besides something addictive, capitalistically, how to create something that would be that alluring. But that's kind of why, I think the course is like trying to figure out that question. Like, can we figure it out by looking at all the bad versions? Can we sort of see the shadow of that? So yeah, I know that's not a good answer, but we'll see. Yeah, Arnab, I have a question.
Yes, Ben. Actually, I was thinking on the topic of universalisms, and whether it's in like countries like India, we have a situation where the post-colonial largely left theorists by for decades they have asked for uh, debunking of Western rationality and science, and not debunking, but rather uh, critique, a critique of Western rationality and science. But this led the Hindu right uh, weaponize these tools of the critic, and turn that narrative on its head by making every kind of uh, pseudo narratives a part of state policy. It's, it's an ongoing process now. So I was thinking how to avoid this trap, because like personally, I think that the registers of Western rationality and science are are might be limited, but they might have their flaws, but is the only hope of rationality we have left in this world. So in a world where 47 countries have populist governments, so I was thinking how to avoid this trap, this weaponization of narratives that the Hindu right made use of. And I think the the alt-right also has weaponized some of uh, the arguments of Western's rationality itself, appropriated or weaponized. So how to avoid this trap? Like, that was my question.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's one of the big questions, right? I mean, on the one hand, as we'll see, a lot of the things I mentioned, right? A lot of the movements, where this pseudo history and a lot of stuff really explodes, and of course it exists. It really explodes at the same time nationhood as a project, right, explodes, right? Like you have the end of empires, and then you have, I've mentioned this, in other contexts with racist biology too, right? The construction of the reconstruction of the identity of the nation, right, happens at the same time we have all this pseudo stuff exploding, because of course people invent, right, a new history for a country that like didn't exist in exactly, before, or a people that didn't exist in a kind of coherent way. So that's very hard to separate, right? I mean, I agree, like I'm sympathetic to, an expanded notion of rationality. Like, I don't think rationality is bad if it's actually rationality. But that's, of course, part of the whole problem, right? Because, of course, you had great rationalists saying, all kinds of things, and then, of course, claiming certain people didn't count as people. And so I guess my point is that, what would a rationality without myths look like? Or you could say, what's the best myth for rationality? Like, could you have a myth for rationality that is not a European one? Because to me, that would still be rationality, but it would be, to me like better. It would be like politically more conscious, because of course, I know this from all the eugenics stuff I have to read and things like this, right? You have lots of people claiming to be rational, apolitical, agents who just look at the statistics, right? That's one example. And of course, they're completely motivated by racist assumptions, but they just hide behind, cherry-picked numbers, right? That's a very common thing. And so to me, it's like you have to find a way that, and it's not just bias, right? That's the problem. People say, oh, that's bias. It's like, well, no, right? It's because it's a shared bias, right? And that shared bias, it's not like, oh, some bad actors, right? It's a belief in certain, it's a supremacy, right? I think supremacy is the ultimate problem. Like, how do you have rationality without supremacy? I think to me that's the really hard question. That's a really hard question, but it's one I want to try to figure out in the class, if that makes sense.
Excellent, Ben. Thank you. Thank you.
So then someone else asks, is it possible to conceive a myth outside of the coordinates of what's usually called cunning rationality? Yeah, considering that most myths are not only part of the canon of political organization, which empires see myth. Yeah. Yeah, is it possible to have a myth that isn't cunning? Yeah, I mean that's I think that's part of Winter's question, right? I think Winter is basically, can you have like a non-self-interested myth? Or not self-interested maybe, but can you have like a non-Volkish myth, right? Can you have a myth that isn't like a particular community trying to justify its existence over and against others? And that's, I think, one of Winter's big questions. She seems to say, yes, it's possible, but she doesn't know what it is, right? because we've never seen a myth about the human. We've only ever seen myths about man, right? About or we've seen myths from cultures sort of in fight or like trying to fight against or survive this myth, this other myth. And so, I think, I would, from Winter's perspective, I would assume it's okay if a myth is cunning as long as the motivations are right. I think if the motivations are good, and that's the whole problem, right? Like, can you have a myth? Like, can you have a myth that isn't othering? I think that's also the other question. And she seems to think, you know, you know, she seems to say that is possible. But again, to me, it's like I want to sort of flesh out all these sort of mythic hangovers, right, in these different periods that she sees, to really try to get to the point of like, okay, what would an actually, good, or if we want to say, politically operable myth, be? Yeah, again, that's I think that's one of the questions of the course. Try to see it. Okay. I don't know if there's any other questions, but if not, I can also talk about some practical things just really quick. So I don't know how many, last time I checked, there was, because we only have about 9 minutes left. There was, at my last check, I think 34 people enrolled, if that's correct. So just to say that sort of poses that poses a practical problem. I don't know if that's true. Maybe it's shrunk. Maybe it will shrink. But as of now, right, there's 3 presenters per text, and there's 9 texts, right? There's three meetings with 3 texts each, so that only makes 27 presenters. So, if the number like stays that high, what I'll do is I can post some other options for presenting. Maybe instead of presenting on texts, I can also make some options, and I'll do that. I can try to do that today. Hopefully, like people could present on some figures or groups, right? Because part of the difficulty of preparing for this class is maybe you sensed when in the lecture is that there's a lot. As is the case with like esoteric adjacent or things like theosophy or things like this, is they touch upon a lot of very different worlds. And so, for instance, like knowing a bit about, even, like new spiritualist movements or things like this can be helpful in the context of the course, right? So I can definitely add, yeah, like I said, if the number stays high, I can add some other options for presentations. Yeah, that will just be on like a movement or a particular figure, if that works for people. Because in that way we don't like sort of overload people with more texts. But yeah, I also added, like I said, I added a winter text to the end, to the final class. I'll upload it. I can upload it today, but also you can find it if you Google it. Either the PDF comes up immediately. Yeah, so I think that's all the practicals. I think that's the sort of main thing to talk about. Did people have any other questions about any of that? Yes, Mita?
Right. Are the Did you like assign people already to text? Is that something that already No, okay, so we'll see that somewhere.
Yeah, it's on
Okay.
the spreadsheet, which I think, if I'm not wrong, that you can see. They said that was last time. I'm not sure if that is available to the students.
Or
Yeah.
like where would we find that?
I'm going to put it on the drive right
Oh,
after
okay.
the class.
Awesome.
Yeah. So then there's slots for each text, and it's by week. So there's like 3 texts a week.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Yeah. Um, yeah. And like I said, they range kind of all over the place. Some are fiction. There's like a, film, and there's also kind of like more hardcore theory stuff. But yeah, I think it should be pretty easy, even if the texts are short, to have multiple people do them, because like I said, the nature of the course is that it's sort of why I put the Lovecraft story today as a kind of taster, because you can just see like you know, it has this kind of conspiratorial mindset, you know, baked into it, which means you can go lots of places, and then there's like lots of weird references. So I think it's quite easy to share the presentations. Yeah. But yeah, so yeah, after the class, people can sign up for that, and then hopefully, like I said, if there's people who don't have anything, I will make some more spaces for figures and movements and stuff. So yeah, if you like doing more historical stuff, then you can wait. Okay. Anything else from anybody? As I said, you know, hopefully we'll have much more discussion and less me blah blah blah. But yeah, as usual, just want to sort of set the stage, as kind of odd as it is and as wide as it is, trying to think this stuff. Yeah, or if anybody wants any like casual reading, like I did mention it in passing, but you will also see a lot of, like I said, if you're into comics, for instance, if you look at like the comics like Hellboy, or like a lot of the stuff by Alan Moore, you'll sort of see this attempt to like, yeah, sort of depoliticize or even like repoliticize this stuff, which so they can be kind of a nice like accompaniment if people are interested. You know, kind of gives you a different, yeah, a sort of attempt to rework this mythic and kind of fantastical history into something, yeah, if not left wing, at least not right wing, potentially. So yeah, that's, you know, a sort of side move if people are interested. Okay. Well, if there's nothing else. Oh yeah, Carlos.
Yeah, I was just thinking, just when you were mentioning in relation to Winter's kind of like pitching on spoken word against written word, I'm kind of like just thinking on this in relation on like this kind of like myth making, like or like just like when myths actually work. And just like also when you were talking about that they, I mean, one of the obvious things is like this technique on like the adding this temporal kind of like element on like the myth or like this timeless or like, sorry, like this timeline or thread. And I'm just kind of like thinking on obviously like one of the strategies that I kind of like understand from Winters going against the written word is based on like the book or like just like the book kind of like publishing in a way. And I'm kind of like thinking on in a contemporary term, like this when we see, I mean, we've kind of like gone from word of mouth, kind of like, you know, narratives like being or myths being just spoken over the centuries to currently also being able to tangibilize somehow or record spoken word into what you were also talking about, which is podcasting or things like this. And I'm kind of like just thinking, how would you see this, yeah, like element of successful myth making in today's, I mean, we've talked about this also algorithmic, yeah, funneling or something like we're channeling, but just, yeah, I'm kind of like this, I don't know, it was kind of like just like an open thought that I had about this, yeah, tangibilizing of the myth, you know, like this from the pitching of the book to, you know, the recording of the book, like of, you know, of language or like this, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think a big part of the issue is like the sort of notion of place being kind of obliterated with myth, or if not obliterated, like, because when, you know, I think some of the texts in Winter talks about going against the written word or like literature or like the novel as this kind of, you know, pastime of the bourgeois individual, right? Like the ones who can afford to sit and read a book and think a world in only their own thoughts, right? As opposed to some of the, right, she talks a lot about musical practices, right? So she talks about like Janu or like this kind of like drum practices and this whole idea about it's very much about the place, right? It's very much about a community. And so when you make the myth, you're always making it like in a sort of uh not like a total immediacy, but like a sort of, evental, like event-based and communal moment, right? And that's why it makes, and I think in that sense, it makes the kind of pleasure, pain, reward system, as she calls it, mode of the myth very clear, right? Like you kind of see the inclusion exclusion thing happening or whatever it is, right? You see the myth making on the bodies that are present, like immediately, or like at least the start of it. And I guess the issue or the trick with something like, you think about how and I guess the question might be, is that what makes, is there a difference between that and conspiratorial thinking, for instance? Like maybe when you start to have like crazy shit on podcasts, you have like Pizzagate or like all these, like lizard people, pedophile, global elite, blah, 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 whatever you want to say. And that people can just mention it, like, yeah, word of mouth on, Joe Rogan or whatever. Um, or, this idea that I think there the difference is like the community, you don't have to worry about the community making aspect of it. It's going to happen just because of sheer volume and because of how many people will hear it. So you don't have to like recruit anybody. It's just going to kind of happen. And of course, it's like recruiting through its like pleasure making thing rather than being a pleasure making thing to fit and work through a community. The community, like this is why like the social part of social media, like the social part is like an after effect in a way, right? Because I think it's like it's making itself like, here's some crazy shit. Who likes how this sounds, right? I think it's very different than let's construct a practice together that motivates us to do things together, right? I feel like the togetherness is like just happens through like, an effective recruitment, just by way of volume, if that makes sense. And so I think but I think maybe that's maybe, I don't know if this is for sure right, but I suspect that might mark the difference between a myth and a conspiracy. Um, maybe, but that's something to also think about. But it's a good question.
Thanks.
Okay, if there's nothing else, like the reading, let me just see, check. Yeah, so the reading for yeah, next week is kind of more like sort of fiction oriented. I mean, there's the Bataille text, which is very short but quite dense. I mean, there was a quote from it today. And then this kind of short story, which is not I mean, I can just say it's not a good short story. So the one by Service, you should sort of hate, or I mean, you can read it as you like, but it can definitely be a hate read. So the Edison's Conquest of Mars text, it's very much like a revenge, or it's very much a sort of revenge of Western nationality text in a weird way. But it's also, as far as I have found, the first alien astronaut text. So people have credited Lovecraft with doing this first, but actually this text is older. So it's a very bizarre text about aliens showing up on Mars and ancient astronauts and all that kind of stuff. And then um, then this book, or this kind of extract from Sprague Comp, which also, if people really like the theme of the course, you could definitely read that whole book. It's one of the best like anti-pseudo archaeology books I think that's ever been written, or at least for a long time. So also he really critiquing and looking at the desire to like, why is all this obsession with Atlantis and so on. Yeah, and then the Bataille text, which is very short and more impressionistic, as he is wont to do. So yeah, basically kind of looking at why these constructions take place and what's the relationship between them and fiction would be the kind of things to think about for next week. Yeah. So yeah, sign up for the presentations once the thing is put up, and that's it for me, I would say. Yeah, hopefully it wasn't too painful, and hopefully we have some good discussions, some good discussions next week.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Ben, bye.
Thanks.